in discussing firm theory, we said that the firm actually chooses its quantity rather than its price. And this chosen Q actually has a corresponding price based on the demand curve. And so when we recall our revenue equation, R is actually equal to P times Q. This is our revenue equation for a firm. And as we recall, in the case of a monopolist, P is actually a function of Q. And we also recall that this Q here is actually capital Q representing market quantity. Well, it doesn't really matter which one we use, but just for uniformity, we use capital Q in this case. And this would now be equal to our revenue. And we also said last video that this P of Q here, is our inverse market demand function, meaning price is actually determined by quantity, rather than quantity being determined by price. And the firm actually uses this, the inverse demand function, the firm actually uses this because the firm is trying to determine the output or the profit maximizing output that it should produce, meaning the firm is actually trying to solve for Q and allowing price to be determined by the quantity set by the firm and the demand of the market. So let's actually take a closer look at the revenue here. As we discussed in previous videos, revenue, we have average revenue, and marginal revenue. And we'll go for average revenue first since it looks a bit more simple. Average revenue is simply our revenue divided by quantity. And this is simply equal to P of Q. So in the monopolist's case, the average revenue of the monopolist is actually equal to the inverse demand function, as we see here. On the other hand, we have the marginal revenue, which is equal to the partial derivative, or derivative, since it's only based on Q, the derivative of R with respect to Q. And this, using the product rule in calculus, we find that this is equal to P of Q plus the partial derivative of P of Q with respect to Q multiplied by Q. And so the reason why we actually took this marginal revenue here, why we actually got this marginal revenue, is because we want to find how elasticity and marginal revenue have a relationship. So if we were to manipulate this part here, we are going to find the relationship of elasticity and marginal revenue. So if we recall what our elasticity is from consumer theory, the price elasticity of demand was actually the derivative of Q with respect to P multiplied by P over Q. And this is our elasticity of demand. The percent change in quantity with respect to a percent change in price, and that's price elasticity of demand. So we're trying to find this thing in our marginal revenue here. So again, let's focus on this equation here, and we will be trying to manipulate this equation by multiplying it by P of Q over P of Q, essentially multiplying it by 1. So if we do that, if we multiply this whole equation by P of Q over P of Q, we will get P of Q outside multiplied by P of Q over P of Q is 1 plus this whole thing. I'll just copy this. So dPQ with respect to Q multiplied by Q, and by distributing we get Q over P of Q here. And so we see that this thing here is actually the inverse of this thing here. And so we can say actually that marginal revenue is equal to P of Q multiplied by 1 plus 1 over the EP, or epsilon P, which signifies, sorry, this is actually P here, not D. Okay, EP, or epsilon P, which represents the elasticity or the price elasticity of demand. And so now we see that MR is actually related to EP here. And so what? What if we now know that MR and EP are actually related? Well, actually, by knowing the value of epsilon P, or the elasticity, we can actually know whether marginal revenue is positive or negative. And so to do this, first we have to go back to this equation right here. We have to recall that the partial derivative of Q with respect to P is actually a negative number. So is actually less than 0. And the reason for this is we know that the demand function is actually, the demand is actually downward sloping. So P actually changes negatively or decreases as quantity increases. Therefore, the change in Q with respect to P is actually negative. And so we know that a negative number multiplied by a positive over a positive number is actually a negative number. So epsilon P here is actually less than 0. And so now when we look at this part here, and keep in mind that epsilon P is less than 0, we can now write this down. So when EP is equal to 1, this is what we call, from consumer theory, this is what we call unit elasticity. Or at this point, the demand is unit elastic. And at this point also, marginal revenue is equal to 0. When EP is greater than 1, then this is what we call inelastic, or the demand is inelastic at this point, and marginal revenue is less than 0. When EP, I think we all know where this is going, when EP is less than 1, my bad, this is supposed to be -1, -1, and -1. So when this is actually, when EP is less than -1, then this is what we call elastic. So demand is elastic when epsilon P is less than -1, and at this point, marginal revenue is greater than 0. You might be asking, why is marginal revenue affected by EP? How does this add up with intuition? What's all of this for? Well, if we take a look at the demand curve, let me just draw a demand curve here. We take a look at a demand curve, label this properly, take a look at the demand curve. So let's say that this is our market demand, and the monopolist's marginal revenue is, again, we define the marginal revenue of the monopolists as the partial derivative of R with respect to Q, and graphically it looks something like this. And let's label this our marginal revenue of the monopolist. So if we look here, we can actually determine the elasticity of demand using our marginal revenue, or the other way around. So if the firm is producing, let me scroll down a bit. The firm is producing from this point up to this point, this is actually the elastic part of the demand curve. And the reason for this is because marginal revenue is above the horizontal axis, which means at this part here, marginal revenue is greater than 0, and thus the elasticity, the price elasticity of demand is less than -1 and is elastic. At this point here, let me change my color. This point here, marginal revenue is equal to 0. So at this point, the price elasticity of demand is unit elastic. It's unit elastic. And then from that point, or after that point, so after MR is equal 0, you find that MR would now be less than 0. So let's just extend this. We usually deal with only this quadrant of the Cartesian plane, but if we extend our marginal revenue here, we can actually see that at these points, at this part here, marginal revenue becomes negative. And so at these points, when MR is less than 0, right here, at these points from here onwards, the price elasticity of demand is actually inelastic. And so, for example, if we find that at this point here on the demand curve, the elasticity of demand, the price elasticity of demand is actually unit elastic. So we know that at this point, at this quantity, the marginal revenue of the firm is equal to 0. And if we get a point on the demand curve right here and we say that, hey, at this point, this demand is actually elastic. So if it's elastic, that means that our marginal revenue at this quantity of the is greater than 0.